listeners, it's David McGillivray, horror icon and comedy legend, here with another edition of Little Did You Know, the Chat Show, a program in which I talk to people I find interesting, and I hope you agree. My guest this week ran one of the most distinctive cinemas in the world, and that is not an overestimate. To some, it was a notorious flea pit, but it was so much more than that. My guest has carried the torch for this cinema ever since it closed in 1993. And one of the things she's done is write a book, a history of the cinema, which is literally the size of a doorstep. The cinema was the one and only Scala in London, and my guest is its former programmer, the very wonderful Jane Giles.
Hello, David, and the world.
Indeed, yes, it is the world. We're going to be talking to the world for the next 45 minutes. But first of all, I can see behind you the very distinctive Scala calendar. Now that's an iconic image. It became very collectible. Which one is that? What date does that come from?
That's July 1991, which was the 10th birthday of the Scala in King's Cross. And the programmes were always designed by Mike Leedham and his team at 2D Design, who are still going, actually, based in Ironmonger Row. Well, when it's not lockdown, they're based in Ironmonger Row. And they're fantastic poster designers, and they designed many of the repertory cinema programs, not just for the Scala, but for other cinemas as well, in the 1970s and the 80s.
I used to look forward to getting that every month. I was a Scala regular. As we said at the beginning of the show, Jane, we've got viewers from all over the world. So I know this is an impossible thing to do, but can you briefly describe the Scala for the benefit of those who may not have heard of it and who were never there?
Yes, certainly, David, and viewers from all over the world. The Scala was a repertory cinema, which means that it showed a repeating programme, different films every day, in double or triple bills or all-nighters on Saturday. It started its life in a fairly newly built cinema that was built in 1976 near Goodge Street in central London, just off Charlotte Street and Tottenham Court Road. And the cinema was sort of based along the lines of a socialist cinema model, showing a lot of very earnest documentaries. And then along came a teenage ticket-tearing manager called Stephen Woolley, who transformed it into a real rock and roll cinema. And that was 1978. And he never looked back. He employed young people and people who took risks in showing films that other cinemas weren't prepared to show. And so the Scala was several years in Tottenham Street, near Goodge Street. And then along came Channel 4, the fourth TV channel, that the Scala got evicted from its premises, which, as I think you know, David, was once upon a time something called the Scala Theatre, which was built in 1905, but had very, very deep roots to the 18th century, actually. But that is a rabbit hole that we dare not go into this morning. Because good things came out of the eviction, actually, the Scala moved up to King's Cross, which was really the making of it, I think, in many ways. It moved into a 1920s cinema, which was enormous. And yes, so there we take up the story.
Of course, Jane, you've only scratched the surface. We're going to go much deeper over the next 45 minutes. Now, something tells me that as the former programmer of this notorious cinema, you may have had a very misspent youth. Is that true?
No, No, not really. I was born in 1964 in Crawley in West Sussex, which is right by Gatwick Airport, and had a fairly miserable youth, as Maria from Sound of Music says. But when I was 16, I changed schools, from the school where my dad worked, which was a state-run comprehensive. My dad was head of PE. So you can imagine it was not particularly much fun for me as a very unsporty kid who got picked for the netball team. And I was like, you know, I couldn't do anything like that. I like movies. But I discovered the Scala when I was 16. I changed schools. I met a bunch of punks at the boys' school that I went to for my sixth form college. They were very adventurous, much more than me. And they were coming up to London to go to gigs and to go to cinemas as well, because there was a real integration in the 70s and the 80s between the music scene and the film scene. And it was August 1981, and they were off to an all-nighter at the Scala. And so I tagged along, and that was my first experience of it.
So the Scala formed your what? Film education?
I think so. The Scala combined with the fact that my dad, the PE teacher, had invested in a Betamax video player in about 1980. And Crawley had one video hire shop, and it had about 10 films to choose from. But over the years, over the early 80s, those films included The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Evil Dead. So these are the two films that people classically talk about being able to rent on video before the Bright Bill that, as we know, clamped down on unclassified VHS, video distribution and exhibition. That, of course, and BBC Two, which showed fantastic films. And the programmer responsible was called Steve Jenkins, who you must have on your show one day, because he's lovely and he really changed people's ideas about film with what he was showing.
Well, later on, you went on to have, let's call, a more conventional film education. You gained an MA in film, but then you saw an advertisement for a programmer at the Scala. You decided that was the job for you. What made you think you could do it?
Well, actually, I was working after I did my film studies. I got a job at Ipswich Film Theatre, Ipswich, for a year. And it was actually a post that was funded by the British Film Institute. And it was called Trainee in Regional Film Theatre Management. And I had a really lovely, I was incredibly lucky to get this job, because apparently the BFI really didn't want me. They wanted some other bloke who was, you know, much more sensible than me. But I somehow managed to get the job. And I think it was my love of the Scala that actually gave me an edge on the application. And so I lived in Ipswich for a year and worked in the film theatre, learning everything from programming to marketing, finance, front of house management. And I had a really lovely mentor called Mark Finch, who was a wonderful man who ran the Piccadilly Film Festival and worked at the BFI in the exhibition unit. And he was really influential on me.
And you were interviewed by the aforementioned Steve Woolley, who went on to run Palace Pictures with the late Nick Powell. Now, did you hit it off with Steve? You must have done, because he gave you the job.
Well, Steve liked the idea that I'd grown up by going to the cinema and that I really knew the Palace by then. So that was 1988, and Palace had been up and running for a good 4 years by that point, or 5 years. Steve liked the fact that I was very tuned into the Palace catalogue, but also that I'd had a years long experience working in another film theatre, and the fact that I, like I said, had grown up at the Scala. So yes, we did hit it off, but Steve, as you probably know, talks even more than I do. So I think I didn't say very much. I just looked at the stuffed wolf in the corner of his office and thought, wow, And I looked at his the wooden floorboards in his office, and I'd never seen wooden floorboards before, and I thought it was very glamorous and sophisticated.
Well, let's firstly talk about the architecture. Let's talk about the building of the Scala outside, and perhaps more importantly, because it was so famous, the interior.
So yeah, the Scala in King's Cross had been planned actually before the First World War, and had the building had started. King's Cross was a very busy transport hub because of the famous train station terminal at King's Cross. So it was a real sort of thriving part of town, but with all the sort of comings and goings that you always get around a train terminus. So the Scala started life at about, I think the first plans were about like 1912. And then the building ground to a halt during the First War. And then it reopened properly in 1920. And it was built as a 1,500 seat cinema with the classic sort of stalls and circle area. And it's beautiful. It was designed by an architect called Courtney Constantine. Harry Courtney Constantine, who was responsible for a number of these picture palaces in North London. There was another one at the Angel, one at Highbury.
But by the time you joined the Scala, is it safe to say it was past its prime, a little decrepit inside?
Yeah, a little. So the Scala went from being this incredible, sort of magnificent pitch palace to, by the 1970s, it had a stint as a rock venue in 1972, where various bands played, including Iggy and the Stooges and Lou Reed and Gary Glitter. And it also was a sex cinema for a little while, and a repertory cinema showing a very kind of like exciting program, but very underattended for a 1,500 seat cinema. So by 1981, the Scala had become something called the Primatarium.
I wanted to, let's talk about that in a minute, because it's one of the many rumours I want to discuss with you. But while on the subject of the auditorium, my memory, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the lights never went up in the auditorium. You fumbled your way in there in the dark and you went out the same way.
Well, yeah, the lights were kept low because it was very dirty. By the time we were there, as the Scala, we were just in what was the former circle area upstairs. The stalls had become a snooker club, and that was a completely separate organisation. And we did keep the lights down fairly low because the carpet was to filth and grime, and but there's a magic to being in the dark, and people liked it. It was like going into another world.
One of the reasons I used to go, yes. Let's talk about the surrounding area at that time. What was King's Cross like?
Well, so I went there first in 1981, as I said, and I was living just up the Caledonian Road when I started work at the Scala in '88. And people would talk about the vice, the prostitutes, the drug dealers, the roughness. But to be honest with you, I never saw anything. I really didn't. I think I must have been just completely blinkered like a horse going from my flat up the Cali Road to my beloved Scala. And I didn't really notice anything. I was never accosted. I was never attacked.
Well, as I always say, and I did live in King's Cross for 22 years, the people didn't bother you unless you wanted to buy something. So if you weren't interested, they let you alone.
Yeah, I guess that was probably it. Maybe, the only thing I ever bought was like a coffee from Gatto Pardo, which was the fantastic Italian cafe that was opposite the Scala.
Oh my goodness, the Gattopardo. You probably know that the Italian film director Dario Argento claimed that they served the best cappuccino in London.
They did, and they had a nice line in cream horns or whatever they call them in Italian as well. But that said, by the late 80s, there were a lot of homeless in King's Cross, and working in the cinema, we tended to see a lot of distressed and dispossessed people. And there was one boy called Craig who camped in the doorway of the Scala for quite a long time.
Let's talk about the policy, the programming policy. Now, you showed everything from Russ Meyer to Ingmar Bergman, so it might appear on the surface as though there wasn't a policy. You could show anything, but that wasn't quite the case, was it?
No, it wasn't quite the case. So the Scala specialised in rock and roll and hard to see movies. I would say that's kind of broadly a sort of, you know, those starting in the late 70s with certain kinds of cult icons like Marlon Brando, James Dean, Marilyn Monroe. So it was that sort of Hollywood classic style programming. And then over the years, the programming became a little bit more extreme. Joanne Seller, who is now a great film producer, she's Paul Thomas Anderson's producer, but she was the one who had a real appetite for horror movies. So it was Joanne who was responsible. Actually, she got the job at the Scala as programmer when she was just 19 years old. So she was even younger than I was when she was working there. And she was quite fearless. She took on the legislation of the Bright Bill, which actually didn't really affect cinemas, but there was a real sense of you know, dismay around the so-called video nasties, and Joanne really tackled that. And then subsequent to Joanne, she had a colleague called Mark Vallon, who was a DJ at the Bell, which was a great pub, lesbian and gay pub just up the road. Yes. Mark developed the lesbian and gay programming at the Scala, the queer programming.
That's right, which was also very important. We come on to the subject of the Scala audience, which I attempted to describe in a book I wrote called Doing Rude Things. We're going to come back to that later in the program as well. But this is what I said. It was described by the person who took over from you, Helen DeWitt, as high on atmosphere, low on comfort. And I said that the cinema attracted a varied clientele: winos, students, punks, minor celebrities, tired businessmen, bikers, goths and OAPs, some of whom had sex in the toilets at 3 a.m. Is that a fair description, Jane?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. It was very interesting, the Scala audience, because you now and again recognise someone, like I get a call from the box office saying, oh, Francis Bacon's just come in to watch Sallow, or David Hockney's back, or Nicholas Rogue's here again. But what we didn't know at the time was that there were lots of people amongst the students and the younger people who were there who would go on to become some very famous filmmakers themselves. So maybe we'll come back to that. But at the time, we saw
a lot of those people went on to support your subsequent projects, didn't they?
Yes, they did. And it wasn't until many years later. The Scala closed in 1993 when the lease ran out, but it wasn't until many years later that I started writing my book that I really began to understand who was in the audience. Because yes, there were the famous people like I say, the Bacons and the Rogues that we recognised. There were a number of very eccentric OAPs, and of course you were far too young to fit that category yourself. But we had a lovely lady called Mrs. Reeve who used to come in with her son, Melvin, and they only liked horror films. They didn't like sex films. Well, when I say sex films, they weren't really porno films. They were more sort of like Euro art house, extreme, like I say, Sallow. And then there was the Russ Meyers. But Mrs. Reeve and Melvin didn't like the bedroom films. They liked the chainsaw films. So we had a few eccentric OAPs, but we also had some very, very young people that came in the cinema and I did an interview the other day with Ryan Gilbey of The Guardian about Night Porter, which was a Scala favourite. And Ryan told me that he was 14 when he came to the Scala to see the film. Now, Ryan, if you know him, has always had a very young look about him. So he must have looked about 8.5 when he came to the Scala to see Night Porter for the first time. Yeah, young people.
Let's talk about some of the rumours surrounding the Scala. Now, maybe you can clear some of these up, true or false. First of all, before the cinema opened in the Scala building, were there wild animals running around inside?
No, false. False, false, false. People thought that, so briefly in 1980, the Scala became the Primatarium, which was the headquarters of the British Primate League. And it was a bit like a sort of London experience, only for primates. And it was run by an eccentric dentist called Cyril Rosen, who invented Nessor dental equipment, which transformed the nation's dental health. Anyway, in short, he had a passion for primates, goodness me, and wanted to educate people about conservation. So he turned the empty Scala cinema into a sort of jungle and had built a fountain in the middle of the cinema, and it was like being in a tropical jungle with sound effects and a slideshow, and it was a terrible flop and lasted less than a year when the Scala cinema moved in. And actually the smell, there was a terrible smell in the cinema, but it wasn't primates, it was damp from the fountain.
But wonderfully, there were still, and they stayed there for a long time, paintings of animals going up the stairs.
Yes, there were murals that Cyril Rosen had painted to show the jungle scenes. Those sort of Douanier Rousseau style murals, and they were lovely. But we did have some not so wild animals. The Scala always had cats, and when I was there, the first Scala cat was called Warren. He was a black cat named after Warren Oates, and when I was there, it was Houston, named after John Houston, and Roy, named after Roy Kinnear, 2 tabby cats.
Well, I was going to say, it was going to be my next question. Why were there always cats running around the auditorium? Periodically, they would leap onto your lap. And during a horror film, that was fantastic. It really did give you a shock. But why were they there?
Just because, well, 2 reasons really. One was the management liked cats, but 2, it kept the mice away. And actually, the Scala never had an infestation problem, which was very rare for cinemas, because cinemas have cafes that serve food. And if you've ever been down to the National Film Theatre, as I like to call it, the BFI South Bank, you'll see the mice running around in the bar area. It's very difficult to get rid of mice. Like every organisation, the Scala had Rentokil coming to do a monthly check, and they never found any sign. It was incredible. And I put it down to the efficiency of the cats, actually, that their very presence just kept them away.
We're going to come back to the last rumour in the second part of the programme, Jane. But right now we're going to take a break because we're going to see a trailer for a film from our lovely hosts, Peccadillo Pictures. Now, unusually, it's not a new film. In fact, it's a very old film from 1985. It's called Buddies. It was the first film to use AIDS as its subject. Something tells me, Jane, it's the sort of film, because we just mentioned briefly LGBT programming just now, it's the sort of film that would have played the Scala.
Yes, definitely. The Scala had a big gay audience and very committed. And the Scala was also often a fundraising, and it fundraised many times for the Terence Higgins Trust and Gay Switchboard and various other organisations.
Let's have a look at Buddies. Enjoy this. Join us again in just a couple of minutes. new restoration there of the 1985 film Buddies, released by Peccadillo Pictures, our hosts. Now, Jane, I launched a book at the Scala quite late on in its history. It was a book called Doing Rude Things. I often hold this up, but when I do, I have to be very careful and put my finger there, because in the past I've been banned from social media by letting that through uncensored. There's a nipple under my finger, ladies and gentlemen. Anyway, when my publisher decided to launch this book, Doing Rude Things, A History of Sex Films, he decided that there was only one possible place for this book to be launched, and that was the Scala Cinema. And it was a remarkable day. We were there all day. We were showing films. We were bringing celebrities of the former sex film industry back together again. I have to say, it was one of the most important and enjoyable days of my life. You'd left by that time. It was organized by your successor, Helen DeWitt. But basically, thank you, Scala Cinema. It's a memory I'll never forget.
I have to say, your story about the screening that day of Esk and Monel is one of my all-time favourite stories about the Scala.
Well, it's true. I've said in the past that the Scala's apparent policy was to screen anything that had half a dozen intact sprocket holes, and the films did break down. It was part of the fun, kids. It doesn't happen anymore, but we used to enjoy that because the film would break down at the Scala, and then there would be a gap and people would start talking to each other. You know, you would talk to complete strangers about what's going on. It was good fun, wasn't it?
It was. If the gap was too long, we had to give people coffee, but the Scala coffee was awful. I don't know if you remember it, David. I mean, it was like the polar opposite of the Gatto Pardo best cappuccino in London. It was like my colleague Alex Fenner, who was she was the general manager of the Scala, and she used to call it the Scala Sludge, and it was so bad.
Why was it so bad? There's no reason.
Because we used to make coffee in those, do you remember those like glass kind of filter jugs, and it just used to sit on the hot plate all day long stewing. And I think the people that worked in the cafe, they thought the more the better, so they put about like 6 packets of coffee in and then stew it in the pot all day long. It was awful.
I didn't know that. I mean, I thought, well, you can't really get coffee wrong. You just heat it up. Surely. Now we know. Now, it wasn't long after I launched the book at the Scala that unfortunately the word went out. The Scala was closing. Now, this is a magazine I used to write for. There it is, What's On in London. And so I wrote a piece for this magazine called Last Picture Show, because at that time it looked as though not only was the Scala closing, but the whole building was going to be demolished. What's the story behind that, Jane?
When I got the job at the Scala, I knew that the whole area was under threat of redevelopment. And when we say threat, what that means is that local businesses be evicted, local residents be evicted, and there'd be like a huge physical transformation of the whole area. And this was because the high speed link up from the Channel Tunnel was scheduled by that point in the early 90s to come into King's Cross. And the plans went right through the middle of the Scala's back corridor, which we called the back passage in those days. So the cinema had a compulsory purchase order from the landlord, British Rail, hanging over it for the entire time that I worked there.
Let's come back now to rumours. We started this in the first part of this episode. So here's another rumour. Can you clear this up? Towards the end of the Scala's tenure at King's Cross, the aforementioned Stephen Woolley, who was making a film called The Crying Game, used to come to the Scala every night and take away the box office to fund his film.
True. He
Ah,
did. Yes, he absolutely did. Because Palace was really struggling by that point, but also the financing of the Crying Game wasn't fully in place by the time that they needed to go into production. So, in order to keep the production together, Steve and Nick had to raid the tills of the Video Palace stores and the Scala Cinema. And it was a very paltry amount of money, but it was just enough to pay people to stay on the set.
that clears that one up. And what about the most famous rumour of all, and that is that the Scala closed because it screened A Clockwork Orange, which at that time Stanley Kubrick had withdrawn from distribution, and he didn't like it.
Well, false, unfortunately. So yes, it's true that the Scala screened A Clockwork Orange, um, but the reason why the cinema closed was the lease ran out. Palace Pictures had gone bankrupt by that point. The directors wound down the Scala as a company because they didn't want to incur any more debt. The audiences were really diminished by the early 90s. By 1993, it was very hard to get an audience. Things had really changed. We were in recession, but most of all, we couldn't redevelop the site and renew the lease. We couldn't get new investment because of compulsory purchase order.
Things had changed radically as well with regard to the kind of films that people could see easily. So when the Scala first opened, correct me if I'm wrong, you were showing films that it was very difficult to see. But by the time you closed, what? The sort of films that the Scala loved were now on video.
Well, yeah, they were start. The video industry had really taken off by over that 10 years between about 1982 and 1992, and it was crucially the cost of the equipment had come down. So whereas once upon a time it would cost £60 to buy a Betamax tape for your machine, you could rent a tape for a couple of quid. But by the early 90s, you could buy VHSs for, I don't know, £15. And it was a very different, at a time of recession, if there's like 3 or 4 of you going to the cinema, and you have to pay for transport, pay for food, pay for cinema tickets. Scala was very cheap, but it made more sense for people to have their own all-nighters at home. The other thing, very briefly, that changed was the liquor licensing laws. There was a time when you couldn't drink in London after 11 p.m. or at a certain time in the afternoon, but the Scala was a licensed membership club. So you could really get up to all sorts, including drinking at the Scala. Yes.
It's true. Now, just before the Scala closed, as I said, you'd moved on. In a sense, you'd moved on to the opposition. At that time, there were still a few repertory cinemas around, not many, but one of them, which still exists today, is the National Film Theatre, a very different cinema from the Scala.
Well, in some ways, it's government funded. The Scala never had a single penny of government funding. Helen tried at the end to get a bailout from the BFI, but she couldn't. So the Scala, so the National Film Theatre, as it sounds, that's that's kind of like a better name for it, because it is the national organisation for film. So it's rightly funded by the government to show a very wide range of films. Um, but the atmosphere is very different. Yeah, the Scala had a real sense of community about it. It had very different audiences, but sometimes they'd all come together in the same space, like classically at the all-nighters. And that was so exciting. People would yell at the screen and they clap and cheer. And during the musical all-nighters, they dance in the aisles. It was really lovely. It's not really something that you get in cinemas, like particularly not in the national, theatre, the national organisation for film.
No, but such is the Scala's influence that the NFT, BFI South Bank as it's now called, now shows the kind of films that were shown at the Scala. So, you know, now you can see sex films there and exploitation films. You never saw that sort of thing before at the NFT. I think that's got a lot to do with the programmers there who used to go to the Scala. What do you think?
Well, maybe. I think some of those programmers are too young to have ever been there, but really like the idea of it. And that was something that I understood, that I wasn't just trying to preserve something in aspect when I wrote the book, that actually Scalarama, which is a sort of annual celebration of programming, is run by very young people, people who are far too young to have ever been at the Scala, but just love the very idea of it. So it's not about nostalgia, it's about a sort of spirit of cinema going.
I'm very glad that the spirit of the Scala carries on. We're going to talk about Scalarama as well, but let's keep it chronological for now because the Scala building was just standing there for a long time after you moved out, and we weren't sure what was going to happen. And then finally, in 1999, it became a dance venue, and funnily enough, it kept up the same sort of policy that you had at the Scala. So the bands that were playing at the Scala were the same kind of bands from the alternative scene that you used to present.
Yeah, that was a really great thing that happened. So, although the Scala as a building had been under compulsory, purchase order threat for a long time, the route of the Channel Tunnel incoming got rerouted around the back of St Pancras instead of right through the middle of King's Cross. Um, so the building, which is actually sitting over the train tracks on stilts, as I learned quite recently, I didn't know this at the time, the whole building used to rumble when the trains go underneath it. Um, but it's it's really hard for British Rail to knock down that building. It's not protected, but the way it's constructed make it very hard to get rid of it and turn it into fancy offices or fancy flats or whatever. So it became a music venue. And it was the brainchild of someone called Sean McCluskey, who is a musician, um, and he set it up with that kind of ethos of, as you say, independent bands. And actually, the Scala is the only sizable independent music venue in London.
Yes. Did you go back and watch bands at the Scala?
I did, but I must admit, it always felt a little bit odd because I had really burnt into my brain and my body the memory, the physical memory of what it was like to be at the Scala Cinema, both as an audience member and as the program manager. And then when I went back, it was like being in a weird kind of fever dream, and it didn't feel right. And I went up to see where my office used to be, and I was shocked, David, because they turned it into a toilet. They turned my office into a toilet. Can you believe it?
I didn't know that, Jane, but the one aspect of the Scala that hasn't changed is the foyer, the staircases, the upstairs foyer. They're all basically the same, aren't they?
It's true. It has a lovely marble staircase, and the word scala does mean staircase in Italian. And so we have a very nice kind of continuity that the new management at the music venue kept the old name, and it really fits the building. Yeah.
In 2018, you went back to the Scala again, this time to launch your book, Your History of the Cinema. But something tells me in that it is absolutely gigantic. This must have been conceived several years before. How did it come about?
I had a friend who ran a publishing company, and we were talking about ideas for books. And actually, Sight and Sound, I'd gone to work at the BFI, and Sight and Sound had asked me to write a big piece about the Scala for one of their editions. And the guys from Scalarama, on the basis of that article, came to have a chat. Um, and I realized I wanted to write more about the Scala story. And also at that time, I was starting to meet people who were there in the audience at the time. And it really made me think that the Scala had been part of the inspiration of these young people in wanting to become filmmakers. And I think what really consolidated it was when Christopher Nolan came to London to take part in a London Film Festival seminar about 35mm film and the importance of it. And of course, me being a lowly film distributor, I couldn't get near him for a conversation. So I was chatting to his assistant, and I asked him to ask his boss whether or not, when he lived in London, he ever went to a cinema called the Scala. And by return, I got a text with a picture of Nolan's membership card from the Scala, which he still keeps in his wallet today. So, and from there, so I thought there's really something in this, and I found that people like Martin McDonough and Steve McQueen and James Marsh, and of course Ben Wheatley, Peter Strickland, Carol Morley, Joanna Hogg. There's so many filmmakers who were there at the time. Can I show you my book?
Hold it up, Jane. That's what we're here for. And of course, all these people that Jane's mentioning now helped crowdfund this book. Look at it.
It's huge. That's Houston the cat.
Ah.
I'll give you a quick flash. There we go. So there's the book. It's got every one of the Scala's programs in it, thanks to my wonderful publisher, who is not the first person who thought it would be a good idea to do a book about Scala, but he's the person that actually made it happen, and that's Harvey Fenton at Fab Press. He was a Scalophile himself. He launched his first fanzine at a horror festival at the Scala, and he is, as well as a publisher, he's a designer, and he designed the book, and he's done a fantastic job. It's so great.
Agreed. And remarkably, you've managed to collect every single Scala calendar. They're all there in the book. Jane, how are sales?
I think sales are okay. Part of the problem is of doing a book like this, which really was Harvey's vision. I thought I was writing a normal kind of, book, just a normal paperback, like a history book. It was Harvey that had the vision for the fully illustrated, full of program book with there's like over 1,000 illustrations in the book. I never thought that was possible. Part of the problem was that it was very, very expensive to produce as an object. So the book RRPs at £75. Part of the reason for this is so that like Amazon can't sell it for a £5, basically. But we had a crowdfunding campaign, and lots of Scala friends came out the woodwork, or came forward to back the crowdfunding campaign, and that made it possible for Harvey to go ahead and publish the book.
The spirit of the Scala continues, as we said, and another aspect of this is something that is now called Scala-Rama. Can you tell us, Jane, what is that?
Well, Scala-Rama was set up in, I think, about 2009 or 10 or something like that, 2011. I'm sorry, I can't remember. And it was set up as a celebration of the spirit of the Scala at the Roxy Bar and Grill in Borough. Yes. And it's now UK wide. It's basically a sort of exercise in fun programming.
And while you were speaking, I was looking this up, Jane. I can now tell you it's 10 years ago next year, so there'll be an anniversary. I hope the cinemas are going to be open again by that time.
I hope so.
Yeah, that is what Scala-Rama is. And we ought to talk about Scala's Facebook page as well.
Yes, so please join us. We have a Scala Staff and Friends Facebook group, and everyone's welcome.
So it's called Scala Staff and Friends. And on that site, you can see a film about the Scala. Now, I'm not sure whether it was lost, but whatever the case, It was fairly recently rediscovered. It was made in 1990 for cable TV, and I've reviewed it. In fact, I mentioned in my review Mrs. Reeve, who's in the film. You mentioned her earlier, and I said that she likes car chases and thinks it unlikely that horror films will turn her into a chainsaw wielding maniac. So you remember Mrs. Reeve, and what about Cecil Bonner as well? He was in the film as well. Do you remember that film being made, Jane?
I do. So it's a young man called Michael Clifford, and his DP Terry Stacey, who went on to shoot American Splendor, the Harvey Pekar film. And it was beautifully made. They made it for Cable London, which I don't think exists anymore, as these things don't. And Michael did a great job, and he's been very generous in allowing us to use the footage of the film in various ways. Yes.
You're in the film as well, of course.
I am sorry. There's a noise outside my door. I am. I'm in the film with very short black hair, as I had at the time, and lipstick. I wore very bright red lipstick then every day, and it's all over my teeth. Obviously, nobody bothered to tell me that I'm chatting away with like lipstick on my teeth. And I was going to try and recreate that image for this interview, and I chickened out. I'm really sorry. I got out my red lipstick, and I thought, like many people, you just sort of during lockdown we stopped putting on the slap. So yeah.
That image was so Scala, wasn't it? Lipstick on the teeth.
It was like something out of a John Waters film, indeed. Yeah.
And of course, John Waters was another Scala fan. Whenever you read about the Scala, they're still quoting what he said about the cinema.
Yeah, absolutely. He gave us a fantastic quote. I think he gave the quote to Scalarama actually originally, and he described it as being like a clubhouse for criminals and lunatics and people on drugs, which is a good way to see movies. So it's a fantastic quote. And John's always been a real friend of the Scala. He came to launch Hairspray there just after Divine died, and it was a very strange trip for him. But yeah, no, he's like the sort of patron saint of the Scala.
What a wonderful way to end our conversation, Jane, about the Scala, which will not die, I think I'm right in saying. Do you agree?
No, it won't die. Absolutely.
How,
Never.
how lovely. Jane, we've got to stop there, but only as far as viewers on YouTube are concerned. If you're a Patreon subscriber, and this is where the link comes up again, you can join us right now and enjoy another 15 bonus minutes with me and my special guest, Jane Giles. But for now, it's goodbye, Jane. Thank you. There she goes. And goodbye from me, David McGillivray. Please join me again at the same time next week. I'll have another delightful guest for you. But until then, bye.